terms of cutting their emissions and their contribution to climate change.
Because agriculture contributes an awful lot of greenhouse gases to the climate change problem, doesn't it? And a lot of that is in methane. And the reason they're talking about the energy sector is we had this methane agreement earlier in the week, but it didn't include agriculture, did it? And agriculture is a big problem when it comes to methane.
There were a couple of references to agriculture in there. We know that about a quarter of all warming comes from methane, and that if we cut those methane emissions, we could potentially save ourselves up to 0.3 degrees C of warming by about the middle of the century. So it's really important to get a handle on methane emissions. Agriculture, land use and food systems as a whole, we know contribute up to about a third of all emissions. So from where the food is grown, through to what we buy and eat, through to the 17% or so of food that's wasted globally as well. So it's really important to get a handle on these sectors.
Well, yes, and how do you reduce emissions? Because people need to eat, clearly. So where are the areas where you can cut down emissions?
Well, it's right across the supply chain, and there's a lot of different ways to do that, but I think both agriculture and land use are unique in a sense compared to other sectors of the economy in that they can not just cut their emissions, but farmers can actually be incentivized to restore natural habitats and thereby store more carbon on their farms as well. So they can be potentially part of the solution in drawing down carbon from the atmosphere instead of, at the moment, emitting it into it.
And is one of the key areas there about meat production? I mean, to what extent, if people turn to plant-based diets, would that free up land for those biodiversity, nature-based solutions, but also still feed the planet?
Well, I don't think it's as simple as meat versus plant-based, for example. And we know that people are already turning to some of those alternatives. So we've seen analysis that shows that people in the UK are beginning to shift their diets, perhaps eating a bit more plant-based food for a whole range of different reasons out of their own personal choice. And there's a difference between some beef that's imported from Brazil that has been grown on land, reared on land that's been deforested, and beef that's grown on a very tree-covered hillside in the north of England. So not all meat is equal. And we're beginning to see supermarkets recognise that consumers are very concerned about the environmental deforestation and climate impacts of the food that they buy off the shelves, with this pledge from 5 of the UK's major supermarkets to halve their environmental impact in the coming years.
Well, that's right. That's come out today, hasn't it, in conjunction with the World Wildlife Fund, the WWF. So how are they planning to do that?
Well, we haven't seen the detail on how they're planning to do it at the moment, but WWF says that it's done that in conjunction with them, but we'll be watching very closely how they go about doing that. So we're seeing a recognition from the private sector that they need to act and respond to their consumers' concerns, alongside this pledge from 45 governments as well, that they want to tackle the emissions from the farming sector and change the way in which farmers are incentivised and public money is used to support farmers.
Yes, because that was one of the central pledges that we've had announced today by COP and the Environment Secretary, George Eustice. So tell us a bit more about that. 45 countries pledging to step up protection of nature and overhaul farming to cut greenhouse gas emissions. What kind of details have they given on that?
Well, there'll be a whole range of things, and some of this has already been announced in the previous days. So there is money, $4 billion for innovation in agriculture, and that's important because new technologies can help farmers to produce more food from the same amount of land. It can also help them to cut their reliance on fossil fuels. And just as an aside, earlier in the year, we saw that farmers are as exposed as anyone else to the impact of soaring fossil fuel prices when gas prices rose very significantly. Alongside technology and innovation, there will also be funding flowing towards, we've heard today, £500 million from the UK government, for example, towards foresters and farmers in other parts of the world to support them to produce food in more sustainable ways and to limit the amount of deforestation that occurs as a result of that.
And of course, we've had various agreements, including this one today, all building towards this ultimate aim of keeping global warming capped at 1.5 degrees. And I'm just going to show everyone our data dashboard. Love to bring in some data when we can. There is the figure for current global warming since the Industrial Revolution. It's over 1.2 degrees at present and ticking up all the time. So just to remind everybody why we're talking about all of this. So in terms of those announcements, I mean, it's not very precise. It sounds quite general. Is that good news? Is it what people wanted to hear as far as agriculture and land use was concerned? Was everyone going to see this as a win, or does it sound wishy-washy?
I think the key thing to take away is that these issues, nature and particularly farming, have largely been overlooked at previous UN climate summits, and as a result, in the 2030 plans that many countries have put forward for cutting their emissions, agriculture and nature are not treated very specifically or are missing altogether. So there was a report out yesterday from the Food and Land Use Coalition which looked at 15 of the 2030 climate plans of G20 countries and found that from half of them, there were no measures describing how emissions from these two sectors would be reduced. So I think a lot of people will very much be welcoming the fact that these items are now clearly firmly on the agenda, are in a plenary room here in Glasgow, and are being talked about by ministers and secretaries of state from some of the most important agricultural and nature countries in the world.
So we've talked a lot about global warming in terms of limiting emissions, either methane emissions or otherwise, greenhouse gas emissions, and how efforts are being made to reduce those. But there's also the other side of the coin is the fact that a lot of farms, a lot of agriculture around the world is being affected by climate change, isn't it? So, and that poses a potential problem for food security, for people getting access to food and livelihoods as well. Farmers perhaps being driven from areas that they've traditionally farmed for centuries because climate change has affected their ability to farm there.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And there was new analysis out from NASA just a few days ago, which showed that crops like corn, for example, could fall in terms of their yield by half by 2030. So climate change could pose real risks for some of the staple crops in developing countries and for the developed world in the coming years. And we've seen some of these effects on our own doorstep in the UK. In years like this, when we've had extreme heat followed by extreme rain, we've seen crops of fruits and potatoes and wheat, for example, affected by that. And farmers are feeling those effects not just on the crops that they're able to get off the field, but also in terms of their bottom lines. So it's both about incentivising farmers to cut their emissions and store more carbon in the land, but also, as you say, about helping them to deal with the impacts of climate change as one of the most affected communities worldwide.
And I want to talk again about this issue of meat versus plant-based diets, because we had the UK's net zero strategy out in the last few weeks in the run-up to COP26. There was no mention of a food strategy, even though there had been some suggestion that there was a paper that wasn't included in the end. I mean, it is politically uncomfortable for some governments, isn't it, to release instructions on what people should eat. It's a delicate subject, isn't it, because people might feel that they're being told to give up certain freedoms of choice when it comes to food. I mean, do you think that is an issue? Are governments queasy about laying down guidelines on food?
Well, I think it's really promising that governments are beginning to really get to grips with these sectors, and the net zero strategy included farming and agriculture and nature and took those head on as one of the bits of the economy that it wanted to see emissions cuts from. The Climate Change Committee, which is the government's official advisory body on climate change issues, said that that was perhaps one of the weaker areas of the strategy compared to others and that more detail was needed. But at the same time, earlier in the year, in June or July, the government had commissioned an independent study by Henry Dimbleby, which was produced, the National Food Strategy, and it will be responding in detail to that in the coming months. So looking much more in depth at the whole food system and what needs to be done there for nature, for climate and for people's health.
Well, yes, that's right. And they said that they recommended meat consumption in the UK fall by 30% over the next 10 years. And you said that daily meat consumption was already falling in this country. I think it was down 17% in the last decade. That's recent statistics suggest. So do you think that people are taking on board the message about climate change and are choosing to shift towards a meat-free diet generally? Is that the reason behind that change in habits, do you think?
I think what's shown in some of that analysis and polling is that people have a whole range of different reasons for making those changes. The environment or the climate is one of them, alongside health issues, alongside lots of others. But I think people are definitely getting the message about the link between nature, farming and the climate, and the pandemic has reminded us all of the importance of the countryside and access to nature and of the connection between food and our health as well. So I think people are really beginning to understand that, and as we've seen today, governments and companies are hearing that message and hearing the message of the farmers on the streets today in Glasgow who are saying that they want a seat at the table, and with the pledges that we've seen today from governments and companies beginning to respond to those messages.
Yes, and I'll ask you a little bit more about what the other companies are doing as well, but just another question on this issue of meat. I noticed that the US Secretary of Agriculture, Thomas Vilsack, has said that Americans can carry on eating meat while keeping the world within the safe limits on global heating. He's talked about making meat production more efficient. He said the amount of methane produced by farm animals can be reduced. There are ways of reducing carbon from farming. I mean, what kind of ways, what are those methods, do you think? I mean, obviously we don't know what it's in his mind, but what methods are there for keeping meat production at similar levels but reducing emissions?
Well, I think there are a whole range of different ways, and we're really at the beginning of this journey of decarbonising the farming sector. We're sort of where we might have been 10 years ago with something like the energy sector. And experts are saying that there's a whole range of different things that can be done, from changing the diets that livestock are fed on, through to through to the sizes of herds that are reared. And as I said before, there's a really big difference between different types of meat. So meat that is grown on land in Brazil that's been deforested is very different to meat that is reared on, a hillside covered with trees and hedgerows in the north of England. Beef consumption in the UK has been falling as well, and chicken consumption has been going up. And chickens are most of the time fed on grain that, again, is imported from Brazil. And I think consumers are really beginning to realise the connection between much of the imported food that we buy off the supermarket shelves and deforestation overseas.
So what do you make of the forest commitment this week? I mean, does that sound like a promising move forward, because it included lots of different elements, including that sense that the people who are farming land that's been cleared of trees through perhaps illegal logging and deforestation need to be compensated in some way. They need to have their livelihoods compensated for.
Well, I think this was one of the biggest ever public finance packages for forests, so that was one of the notable things about this. And there was a real recognition at the heart of it of not only the rights of, but also the importance of getting funding to indigenous peoples and local communities. 80% of the world's remaining nature is looked after by indigenous people who make up just 5% of the world's population. So that was really important. There are a number of different elements to the package, and what we might see is more countries potentially following the UK's lead. The UK is currently putting a piece of legislation through the Parliament in order to make some types of deforestation in its supply chain, so in the imports that companies bring into the country, illegal.
Well, Matt Williams, it's been absolutely fascinating talking to you. I've learned so much. Thanks very much indeed for your time. Matt Williams there from the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit. We appreciate it. Thank you.